You are the type of owner who would never leave your dog behind. Not for anything. But there was a time not long ago when the soldiers who loved their dogs most had no choice. Because the military didn't see those dogs as partners. It saw them as equipment. And what happens to equipment when a mission ends? It gets left behind. This is the story of military working dogs, the ones who ran into gunfire, who sniffed out bombs, who slept beside soldiers in the dark and kept them alive through the night. And it is the story of the regulations that classified those dogs as surplus gear, of the handlers who came home broken, and of the long fight to change what loyalty means under military law. It started the way most loyal relationships do, quietly, without ceremony. A soldier arrives at a forward operating base somewhere in the Middle East. It's hot, the kind of heat that sits on your chest. He's handed a leash. On the other end of it is a dog, compact, alert, watching him with steady brown eyes. The handler doesn't know it yet, but this animal is about to become the most important relationship of his deployment. They train together for weeks before going into the field. The dog learns his voice. He learns the dog's tells the way the ears shift slightly forward when something is wrong, the almost imperceptible pause before a change in direction. By the time they run their first patrol together, they aren't two individuals anymore. They're a system, a single moving unit that communicates without words. And here is what makes that bond so specific, so unlike anything a civilian relationship can replicate. The dog doesn't know rank, doesn't care about protocol. When the handler is scared, the dog feels it. When the handler is steady, the dog is steady. It's a feedback loop built on pure trust, and it runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in conditions that would break most people. One handler will call him Marcus, a composite of the real men whose stories have been documented by journalists, veterans organizations, and advocacy groups over the past 3 decades, describes his dog saving his patrol not once, but 4 times in a single 6-month rotation. A buried device on a road that looked like every other road, a room that smelled wrong, an approach path that the dog simply refused to take, sitting down hard, ears flat, refusing to move. Marcus pushed the leash gently. The dog didn't move. The patrol went around. Later, the bomb disposal unit confirmed what was waiting on that path. And after moments like that, after you have been saved by an animal who had no obligation to save you, who did it through nothing but training and instinct, and an unbreakable desire to stay close to you, what happens? When the deployment ends. For decades, the answer was devastating. Here is the regulation that almost nobody talked about publicly, but that every handler knew. Military working dogs in the United States were classified, for most of the 20th century, not as service members, not as partners, not as living creatures with bonds and histories, but as equipment, specifically as K-9 equipment under military property codes. That classification meant something precise and brutal. When a dog's service was deemed complete, when a unit redeployed, when a dog was injured beyond operational capacity, when a mission ended, the dog could be, and often was, euthanized or simply left behind in the country where it had served. Not retired, not transferred, not brought home. Left. Marcus received his redeployment orders on a Tuesday. He had 72 hours. He asked his commanding officer about the dog. The answer came back through channels. The dog was being reassigned to a foreign military unit. There would be no further information, no contact, no way to know what happened next. He packed his gear. He folded the dog's worn training vest and left it on a cot because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away and couldn't bring himself to take it home either. He walked out without looking back because looking back would have made it impossible to keep walking. That moment, that specific, documented kind of moment, repeated itself hundreds of times across decades of American military service. Vietnam, the Gulf War, the years in Iraq and Afghanistan that stretched through the 2000s and into the 2010s. Handlers came home, dogs didn't, and the handlers didn't talk about it, because who do you tell? Who understands that you are grieving an animal who saved your life and whom you were legally prohibited from bringing home? The military culture of the time didn't have space for that conversation. You were a soldier. You moved on. Except they didn't move on. Not really. Veterans, mental health researchers, and advocacy journalists began documenting something in the early 2000s, a pattern in handler communities. Former military dog handlers showed rates of PTSD and adjustment disorders that were statistically notable even compared to other combat veterans. And a recurring theme emerged in their accounts: the inability to bring their dogs home wasn't just a logistical frustration. For many, it was a moral injury, a wound that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with abandonment specifically. The feeling that they had abandoned the one being that had trusted them completely. Marcus told one interviewer years later, "I came home and I couldn't sleep in a bed. I slept on the floor for 3 months. My wife didn't understand. I didn't understand it either, not at first. But eventually I realized I was waiting for the dog to come back. I kept leaving space for him." The bureaucratic machinery that created this situation had its own internal logic, as bureaucracies always do. Military working dogs were expensive to train. Some estimates put the cost of fully training a military working dog at $40,000 or more. They were considered operational assets, and when the military transferred dogs to foreign allies, it was presented as a form of continued utility, the asset remaining in the field, continuing to serve a purpose. But purpose and loyalty are not the same thing, and the people who understood that most clearly were the ones holding the empty leashes. Change, when it came slowly, and through a combination of forces that rarely get credit for working together: veterans who spoke out, journalists who listened, and one piece of legislation that rewrote the rules. In 2000, the United States Congress passed what became known informally among handler communities as the Military Dog Adoption Law, a provision that, for the first time, allowed military working dogs to be officially adopted at the end of their service. Retired dogs could be adopted by their handlers, by law enforcement agencies, or by approved civilians. The classification of dogs as disposable equipment wasn't erased overnight, but a legal pathway home was opened for the first time. For the handlers who had already come home without their dogs, the law was bittersweet. It came too late for their specific animals. But it meant something for the next generation of handlers, and it meant something symbolically, because laws carry meaning beyond their text. This one said these animals are worth bringing home, but the law created its own complications. The adoption process required paperwork, veterinary clearances, and transport arrangements that could take months. Dogs that had served in overseas theaters needed to clear customs, quarantine requirements, and medical evaluations. The financial cost of transporting a dog from a base in the Middle East to a home in the American Midwest could run into thousands of dollars, and that cost, for years, fell entirely on the handler. So you had handlers who wanted their dogs back, who now legally could have their dogs back, but who couldn't always afford the process of getting them back. The emotional barrier had been cleared. The financial and logistical barriers remained. This is where the story gets complicated in a different way, because it reveals something true about how systems work. A regulation changes, a law passes, and everyone assumes the problem is solved. But the people inside the system know the truth: changing the rule is the beginning, not the end. Nonprofit organizations began to fill the gap. Groups dedicated specifically to military working, dog welfare started raising funds to cover the transport costs that handlers couldn't. Volunteers coordinated flights, arranged temporary foster care during quarantine periods, and navigated the paperwork on behalf of handlers who were still processing redeployment and in no condition to manage international pet transport. Logistics. One of the more affecting details that emerges from first-hand handler accounts is how the reunions unfolded. A dog would arrive at an airport cargo facility. The handler, sometimes with a spouse, sometimes alone, sometimes with children who had heard about this dog for months, would wait at a chain-link gate. The crate would come through on a trolley, and then the latch would open. The dogs remembered. That's what the handlers say universally across dozens of documented reunions. It didn't matter if 6 months had passed or 2 years. The dog came out of the crate, found the handler's scent, and went still for 1 second, that specific kind of stillness that means recognition. That means something internal has clicked back into place, and then everything was movement and noise, and a handler on his knees on a cargo facility floor, not caring at all who was watching. Marcus never got that moment. His dog was gone before the law changed, but he followed the reunions obsessively, watching videos online, reading accounts in veterans' publications. He described it once as watching something I needed to know was possible, even though it wasn't possible for me. That tension between the handlers who made it home in time and the ones who didn't runs through the entire history of military working dog policy. Because the policy didn't change because of one event or one politician or one moment of institutional awakening. It changed because enough individual people refused to stop talking about what they had lost. The story of military working dogs in American history is not a story with clean edges. These animals served in conflicts that were themselves contested wars that divided the country, operations that remain classified, theaters of deployment that produced no clear victories. The dogs didn't care about any of that. They cared about the person holding the leash. And that purity of purpose, that absolute, uncomplicated loyalty, is exactly what made the abandonment so hard to bear, and exactly what made the fight to bring them home so emotionally necessary. There's a photograph that circulated widely in veteran advocacy communities, sometime in the mid-2000s. It shows a military working dog in a desert environment, in full operational kit vest, harness, the posture of an animal that has been trained to the edge of its capacity and is completely comfortable there. The handler is just off frame. You can see the edge of his boot in the lower corner. The dog is looking directly at the camera, ears forward, expression entirely calm. Veterans who saw that photograph described a specific reaction, not sadness exactly, but recognition. The recognition of something they understood that most people didn't, that the animal in the photograph was working, yes, but was also waiting. Always underneath the work, waiting to go home. By the 2010s, the culture around military working dogs had shifted visibly. Unit patches began to include dogs. Memorial services for dogs killed in action were documented and shared. A military working dog who died in a raid in 2011 received public tributes that would have been unthinkable 30 years earlier. The cultural acknowledgement was catching up to what the handlers had always known. But acknowledgement is not the same as policy, and policy is not the same as practice. Handlers coming home from late-period conflicts in Afghanistan still reported navigating adoption processes that were slow, expensive, and emotionally exhausting at a moment when they had no reserves left. The law said they could bring their dogs home. The system didn't always make it easy. What changed most durably and most importantly was the internal military classification. In 2000, with the adoption law, dogs became eligible for a different kind of relationship with the military. Over the following decade, further policy adjustments continued to shift how dogs were categorized and handled at the end of service. The language of equipment began to give way slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely to language that acknowledged what handlers and their dogs actually were to each other. Marcus, in the years after his service, became involved in veteran advocacy work. He didn't focus exclusively on military dog issues, he worked on broader veteran transition programs. But he talked about his dog in almost every public appearance he made, because he understood that the dog's story was actually a story about how institutions treat loyalty. He said once, in a community presentation, "My dog didn't have a concept of the regulation that kept him from coming home with me. He just knew I left." And I think about that. I think about what that meant from his perspective. That the person he trusted most, the person whose job it was to keep him safe, just walked away. I couldn't fix that, but I could make sure other handlers didn't have to live with what I lived with. That is the emotional core of the entire history, not the policy, not the legislation, not the nonprofit logistics networks or the cargo facility reunions or the unit patches. The core is this: a dog trusts completely, and the humans on the other end of that trust have a responsibility that doesn't end when the deployment ends. For most of American military history, the institution didn't recognize that responsibility. The handlers did, and their refusal to accept the institutional definition, their insistence that their dogs were not equipment, were never equipment, had always been something more, is what eventually moved the policy. Change doesn't come from the top down in stories like this. It comes from people who know something is wrong and will not stop saying so. From handlers who testified before committees and wrote letters and gave interviews and showed up at public hearings and said, quietly and consistently, "This is not acceptable. This is not who we want to be." Today, military working dogs occupy a different position in the American military structure than they did 30 years ago. The adoption pathway is established. The cultural recognition is real. The policy language has evolved. Dogs who serve can, under the right circumstances, come home to the people who served with them. It is not a perfect system. Bureaucracies are never perfect. There are still cases that fall through the gaps, still handlers who face obstacles that shouldn't exist, still animals whose fates are uncertain. The work of advocacy organizations in this space is ongoing precisely because the system, while improved, still requires pressure to function as it should. But the fundamental question, the one that Marcus and every handler like him was really asking when they asked about their dogs, that question has been answered differently now than it was answered before. A military working dog is not equipment. It never was. And the handlers who refuse to let the institution pretend otherwise are the reason that answer is now, finally, written into the rules. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Marcus, about the dog he couldn't bring home, about what loyalty actually costs, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about the bonds between dogs and the people who love them, stay right here. We have more to tell you. Some dogs become more than companions. They become legends. Subscribe now for more unbelievable true dog stories and explore the trusted gear and books we've linked below inspired by today's video.